Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a presentation looking at the causes of World War I with a focus on international anarchy, and that will link this to the imperial ambitions of the great powers, the alliances they formed, and the militarism that came to dominate Europe, and that brought about an arms race. Now, when it comes to the imperial ambitions of the great powers, I think the key question to ask is whether this was a safe way for nations to compete or whether it was a cause of tension. Lenin, in Imperialism, the highest form of capitalism, published in 1916, so during the war, argued that imperialism and war were inevitable consequences of capitalism and its hunger for raw materials, ever larger markets and places to invest. Germany seemed to think so, as did Russia and Austria-Hungary, while Britain seemed to have proven that it was so, its wealth coming from its empire. Empire was also seen as an expression of power, and Italy and Germany, as newly unified nations, felt left behind in the business of empire building, and saw it as the defining factor in world power status. So there was rivalry and conflict. The rivals varied, the characteristics and intensity of the conflicts varied. From Fashoda to the Russo-Japanese War, to the Moroccan crises and to the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. Different rivals, different characteristics, different intensities. But in Europe they were all resolved without recourse to war. Yet it could still be argued that colonial disputes exacerbated relations between the European powers. For example, when Britain considered Germany's naval threat, and the naval race with Germany was a critical factor in explaining Britain's estrangement from Germany, and in ending Britain's splendid isolation. Yet it could also be argued that colonial disputes acted as a safety valve, a means to satisfy nations' ambitions at home, with room to back down if things didn't work out. And Britain's clash with France at Fashoda, or Britain's concern about Russian expansionism, did not prevent the Triple Entente from happening. Yet, Weltpolitik undoubtedly added to the tension, and Russian and Austria-Hungary and their ambitions in the Balkans, particularly Russia's frustrations at continuously losing out, is a key factor in any explanation of World War I. The key question for the alliances that developed was whether they created a balance of power or whether they were a cause of tension. Countries made alliances mostly out of fear. Fear of being vulnerable, and more than anything, fear of being isolated. They knew they had enemies, but if shared enemies existed, then an alliance provided some sense of security. Hence, the alliances were mostly defensive. But three things need to be considered: the climate in which they were taking place, the past history that had created the fear, and two, the ambitions that also played its part. And though the alliances may have been defensive, they nevertheless identified an enemy, and they led to shared planning. What's more, the war plans were all offensive. That is, they all went on the attack. And a final factor needs to be considered. Who was in control? Who were the decision makers? Was it democratically elected governments responsible to their electorates, or was it an emperor, a Kaiser, and a Tsar? Now, if diplomacy is usually seen as a means to reconcile differences, in the late 19th century it became a means to bully an opponent into giving way, pushing against that opponent as hard as one dare, with the threat of war, and so the risk of war. The historian Dominic Lieven refers to armed diplomacy. And what's more, when looking at the Balkan Wars, both Austria-Hungary and Russia had become accustomed to using mobilization as a diplomatic tool, a threat. And that brings us to the arms race and the war plans that were drawn up. Again, did it create a balance of power, or did it make war more likely? Europe was divided into two camps, and the nearer we get to 1914, they were increasing the size of their armies, their armaments, and their dreadnoughts. As for the armies, three things need to be considered. The size of the standing army, that is, the permanent peacetime army, and the size of the reserves. This means we have to consider the length and type of military service, the arms race itself, and planning, which includes plans for mobilization. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was the most notorious of all the war plans, and certainly the one invoking most debate. But Russia had its own plan, Plan 19A, as did France, Plan 17. Again, all this could be seen as a deterrent, but undoubtedly they were also seen as a threat and raised the tension. And they also increased the temptation to go to war whilst an advantage was held, because that advantage could soon be lost, or even worse, swing in the enemy's favour. Finally, it also increased the need to jump first in a time of crisis. What's more, it tilted power in the decision-making process in a crisis towards the military. The speed required to implement mobilization forced politicians to make decisions in the July crisis of 1914 quicker than had ever previously been the case. And it was hard to resist the warnings of the military. Yet, much as the alliances and war plans may or may not have made a general war in 1914 more likely, they didn't bring about the crisis. And even in July, for war to come about, the decision makers had to want war. War in order to protect what they had, or to add to what they had. War born out of fear, or war born out of ambition. And so you have to link all this to what happened during the July crisis, and the decisions made, and the reasoning behind those decisions. It's the kind of thing I can show you how to do using past questions, if you're interested in tutorials. Just contact me, or better still, get your parents to contact me at historymadeeasier@gmail.com, and we'll see if we can work something out. But for now, let me thank you for listening and wish you the best of luck in your studies. Cheers.